something I enjoyed, but it was something I could control when everything else was out of control. Something I understood when nothing else in life made sense. And so whenever fear or stress or anger or sadness threatened to overwhelm me, I turned to self-harm. And it worked, in a sense. I could temporarily distract myself from whatever was overwhelming me, but it didn't fix anything. And the more I turned to self-harm, the more I needed it, because our brains can become dependent on the dopamine our body produces when we're hurt. So if I had a big test coming up, I'd cut. If I was arguing with my parents, I'd cut. That person that I liked didn't like me back, I'd cut. It wasn't until I was a sophomore in college that I first sought help. Now, I was raised in the church. I was a religion major who wanted to be a pastor. I was working in a church. So I figured I should talk to my pastor. And I shared with him the hurt and the shame and the fear that I'd been carrying for all these years. And with 4 words, he broke me. You're going to hell. 4 words. But they confirmed everything I'd ever been afraid of. I was broken, and there was no hope of fixing me. So I walked away from the church, and I dropped out of school. I moved back home, and I sank into a deep depression. And I cut. For the next 2 years, I tried to get my life back in order. I went back to school. I found a new church. I was playing guitar in their praise band. And a part of me really wanted to join this church, but I was scared. I didn't think they'd want me if they knew just how broken I really was. Eventually, I sat down with Pastor Carla. And for the second time, I shared this story. And I was terrified what she was going to say when I finished. Pastor Carla listened. And then she also said 4 words. There's grace for that. There's grace for that. Y'all, those words changed my life. After hearing those words, I started to share my story with others. I started doing research. I started giving talks. I learned how common self-harm is as a coping mechanism. How many people just like me had embraced a self-destructive behavior in the desperate hope of saving their lives. The more I learned, the more I shared, the more I taught, the more I found healing in the grace that found me. It didn't happen all at once. Recovery is a process. But having my brokenness met by grace made recovery a possibility. And this year, on Easter morning, I celebrated 10 years safe from self-harm. Y'all, I gotta tell you, these 10 years have had the very best and the very worst days of my life so far. And I am not here tonight to testify to my strength or my willpower, but instead to tell you that even 10 years in recovery, I'm every bit as broken as that freshman in high school. And there's grace for that. Like St. Paul says, by the grace of God I am what I am, and God's grace toward me has not been in vain. It's only because I've experienced grace that I'm able to stand here and share grace with others. I want you to hear this. We are all recovering from something. Now, maybe like me, it's self-harm. Maybe it's something else. But from time to time, every single one of us feels broken. And there's grace for that. Because our God is in the business of bringing beauty out of broken things and broken people.
By grace, you have been saved. Through faith. This is not your doing. It is the gift of God, so that no one can boast. For we are what God made us, created in Christ Jesus for good works that God has determined beforehand to be our way of life. God's grace changes everything. And God's grace is for you. But God's grace does not stop with you. Rather, God's grace starts with you. God's grace changes you so that God's grace changes you so that through you, God's grace might change the world. There are many aspects of our world that need to be transformed by the grace of God. Violence, hatred, the aftermath of natural disasters and civil war, poverty, political aggression, division, discrimination, prejudice, apathy. And it is our very identity as beloved children of God, as people who have been changed by the grace of God, to share that grace through our words and our actions in the darkest places of the world, in the darkest places of our society, so that through us, the world might be changed by God's grace. Now, that might seem like an insurmountable task, something that is extremely, maybe impossible, extremely difficult to do at the very least, given the magnitude of the things in the world that need to change. However, we must remember that it is not our job to save the world, because Jesus Christ already did in his death and resurrection. It is our work, though, as people who follow Jesus, if we do truly follow Jesus, to be conduits of God's grace, outside of these four walls, in the darkest places of our world and our society, in our everyday lives. It is our work to be the face and the voice and the hands and the feet of God in the world. It is our work to be the healing balm for those who are broken. It is our work to remind others of the grace that holds on to their rough and jagged edges, and maybe share that news with them for the first time. Now, some or maybe many of you are thinking, yes, but I'm too broken. I'm too imperfect to be useful. Brothers and sisters, in the words of Pastor Starkweather, we are all recovering from something. It might be different, but no matter what it is, there's grace for that. If you feel lost and alone, there's grace for that. If you're struggling with an addiction, there's grace for that. If you're grieving something, whether recent or a while ago, there's grace for that. If you are stressed out and overwhelmed, there's grace for that. If you are angry with God, if you are wondering why things are happening to you the way that they are, if you are doubting in your faith, there's grace for that. If you are struggling with anxiety and depression, there's grace for that. If you feel worthless, if you feel that in some way, shape, or form you are not good enough, or that you are not lovable, there's grace for that. And if you feel that there is some part of yourself that you need to hide, you don't. Because there's grace for that. I would like Pastor Starkweather to have the closing words.
Whatever it is you're carrying tonight, I can promise you this. There's grace for that. By the grace of God, you are what you are, beloved child of God. And God's grace toward you has not and will not be in vain, because grace